Did you know that 2 out of every 3 guys will experience some form of male pattern baldness by the time they're 35? I had no idea. No. Actually, I did. For me, it was more like 25. I wish Keeps, today's sponsor, had been around when I was younger, because all of these advancements in science mean that there are now treatments that can combat the symptoms of hair loss and keep the hair that you have. Look, it's too late for me. My hair's not coming back. But it doesn't have to be too late for you. Unless it already is. Then I mean, this sponsorship isn't relevant to you. But maybe it is. Better yet, you don't have to go broke doing it. Because this is medicine you're probably assuming is expensive. Oh no, Keep starts at just $10 a month. And you can also get prescription shampoo to keep your scalp healthy. How does it work? Well, no need to visit the doctor's office. Just have a quick online consultation, then a discreet package arrives at your door and you can use it in the privacy of your own home. Look, prevention is key. Otherwise this would be a weird ad. So if you're noticing that you're losing your hair, well, it's time to do something about it. Head to keeps.com/megaprojects to get 50% off your first order. Again, keeps.com/megaprojects, and let's get into it. Weighing an astonishing 188 tons, this was the monstrous terror that never quite was. The Panzer VIII Maus, which is Maus in German, in case you were wondering, remains the heaviest tank ever built, an accolade it has held since 1944. Designed by none other than the founder of German sports car manufacturer Porsche, the Panzer VIII Maus arrived late in the game during World War II and has often come to be associated with the inflated, most likely psychotic, almost certainly ego of Adolf Hitler. It was to be truly colossal, but with the Soviet army barreling towards the factory, only 2 hulls were ever built. Only one was fully completed. Say what you like about the Nazis, but they did know how to produce some truly next-generation weaponry. Take your pick from the world's first assault rifle, the STG-44, which appeared in 1943, the world's first ballistic missile, the V-2, which began to rain down on Britain in 1944, or the world's first fighter jet, the Messerschmitt Me-262, which had its first flight in 1941 and entered service in 1944. Look, the Nazis have rightly gone down in history as one of the most despised groups ever, but they sure knew how to build killing machines. Might be one of the reasons they were so despised. Who knew? No wonder so many scientists were quietly repatriated to the UK and the USA after the war. As World War II broke out, Europe was taken by surprise by the relentless speed of the German advance, which came to be known as the Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. These rapid advances typically saw columns of panzer tanks, often supported by infantry, crashing through defenses at speeds that left defenders disorientated and just unable to hold the line. This was a new form of warfare, and boy was it successful. German tanks underwent considerable evolution during World War II. The early Panzer I was quickly followed by, you guessed it, the Panzer II, III, IV, and V, and everyone got bigger, both in terms of size and weight. But as the Germans made their ultimately doomed venture into the Soviet Union, they eventually met their match, the indomitable Soviet T-34 tank. In response, Hitler was like, we need something even bigger! And they built the Panzer VI, better known as the Tiger I. Next came the largest and heaviest mass-produced German tank of the entire war, the Tiger II, weighing a massive 69.8 tons. By the way, this is mega project, so it's time for an absurd analogy. That's about 10 average elephants. Tiger II appeared in 1944, just as the war began to unravel for the Germans, but waiting in the wings was something of absurd proportions. Would it be enough to turn the tide of the war? Spoiler alert, no. The Nazis lost. You knew that. We've actually jumped a little far ahead here. To start the story of the Panzer VIII Maus, we need to return to 1942, a time when everything in Hitler's world was going just great. His armies had smashed their way across Europe and North Africa, the British had been forced into a chaotic retreat at Dunkirk, and his non-aggression pact with Stalin meant that the eastern border of his new Greater Germany was secure. But what do you get a man who already has everything? Ferdinand Porsche first suggested the design of what was then the VK 100.01 Porsche Type 205 to Hitler sometime in June of 1942. This was the super heavy tank Hitler had been craving, and shortly after, Porsche received the go-ahead to build a full-scale mock-up. In reality, the idea of a super heavy tank wasn't new, but a series of plans for such a tank had already been rejected as being unfeasible. Now, before we can carry on, a little backstory on Ferdinand Porsche. Born in 1875, the Austrian-German automobile engineer held the interesting distinction of having 3 separate citizenships throughout his life: Austria-Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and finally Germany. He founded Porsche in 1931, but would also be best remembered for the people's car, the Volkswagen Beetle, which appeared in 1938. Conveniently, the year after, he joined the Nazi Party and the SS, which I'm sure was just a coincidence. As the war progressed, Porsche was often labeled as a mad scientist as his tank designs became more and more complex. His VK4501 design had earlier been rejected by Hitler, but it seemed that Porsche was eager to do his bit for his adopted fatherland. This is an interesting point and has led some to question the feasibility of the entire project. How much of it was simply driven by Porsche's desire to please his Führer while being encouraged to do so by the maniacal brain of Adolf Hitler? Porsche had until spring of 1943 to produce a working prototype. Considering he was planning to build a tank more than twice as heavy as any German tank before it, this was no easy feat. His initial plan included a 150mm L40 gun and a 20mm MG151/20 heavy machine gun, but over the next year several alternatives were tested, including a 127mm naval gun. But who cares about testing when your boss knows best? In January 1943, Hitler interfered in the project and stated that the tank must now come with 128mm and 75mm guns, as well as a machine cannon to be used against aircraft. Hitler knows best, he doesn't. And this is where the problems began, because the initial design just couldn't support such an increase in space for further ammunition. Shortly after, and most likely related to this issue, Porsche announced that the first prototype would be ready in the summer rather than the spring of 1943. To make things slightly more complicated, the production process was to be shared by 2 different companies. Krupp would construct the chassis, turrets, and armaments, while Aukert was responsible for the final assembly. In May 1943, a full wooden mock-up was presented to Hitler, who seemed to like what he saw and ordered 150 of them. He also made another alteration, because of course he did, changing the gun back to the 150mm version because, in his own words, the 128mm looked like a toy gun on such a large tank. On Christmas Eve 1943, the first prototype, minus the turret and known as the V1, finally arrived and went into immediate testing. But this was far from a glorious start. The weight of the tank meant that it could barely move, with the Daimler-Benz MB509 engine inside struggling to get the tank above 13 km an hour, 8 miles per hour, under optimal conditions. Its expected speed had been 20 km an hour, or about 12 miles per hour. The only Panzer VIII mouse to be fully completed was the V2, which arrived in March 1944 and received its engine a few months later, an upgraded MB517 V12 diesel engine producing 1,200 horsepower, the same as the new Chevy Corvette ZR1, by the way, which is set to go on sale over the next couple of years. Fun fact. In terms of its firepower and armor plating, this was a fearsome proposition for enemy tanks. Its weapons included a 128mm KWK-44L55 gun, a coaxial 75mm KWK-44L/36.5 gun, and a coaxial 7.92mm MG34. The coaxial guns, by the way, mean that they're mounted parallel to the main gun of the tank. That was all a mouthful. The main gun was capable of punching a hole in the American Sherman, British Cromwell and Churchill, and Russian T-34 and JS-2 tanks from a distance of over 3,500 meters, which is about 11,500 feet. The armor plating that encased the mouse was also substantial. The front hull was 22 centimeters thick, while the sides and rear were 19 centimeters. The front of the turret came with 24 centimeter plating, and the sides and rear 20 centimeters. Certainly not indestructible, but pretty damn good. The tank came with several interesting engineering quirks. It was far too heavy to use bridges to cross rivers, so it had been designed to ford rivers, meaning it would just drive straight across. Well, actually, not quite. The mouse would have to travel across rivers in pairs, as it couldn't keep its engine running while underwater, for obvious reasons. The solution was for one mouse to remain on shore while the other crossed. They would be connected by an electrical cable, which in theory would provide auxiliary power to the tank, enabling it to travel across the riverbed. And this feature actually gets even better. A large snorkel would be attached to the tank, providing oxygen to the crew inside and allowing it to move underwater at depths of 7.9 meters. That's 26 feet underwater. The mouse would come with a crew of 6, a commando, a gunner, a radio operator, a driver, and 2 loaders. It had a main fuel tank with a capacity of 2,700 liters and an external auxiliary fuel tank capable of holding an extra 1,500 liters. This was at the rear of the tank. This would enable it to travel up to 160 kilometers, that's just 100 miles, before refueling. The tank came with an electric transmission, which was fairly revolutionary at the time. This meant that the mouse did not require a gearbox. Instead, the engine span a dynamo, a small electrical generator, to produce electricity, which in turn powers a motor, and after the drive sprocket, which propels the tank forward. In theory, this should have provided a smooth, continuous ride without the need to change gears, but it was a design that was plagued with problems from the very outset. The summer of 1944 was not a good one for Adolf Hitler. The successful Allied invasion in Normandy had begun the slow process of pushing the German army back towards Germany, while on the Eastern Front, Soviet forces had begun Operation Bagration, which would eventually lead to the largest defeat in German military history. The noose was beginning to tighten, and to top it all off, there was the failed assassination attempt of Hitler on the 20th of July. Exactly 1 week later, Hitler ordered work to cease on further mouse tanks. Exact reasons are not known, but it's thought that with an ever-increasing Allied air superiority, the mouse would have proven easy pickings. Another suggestion is that Hitler had hoped the mouse would be ready to fight off the Allied invasion from Britain, but of course it missed that deadline by a considerable margin. Testing on the V-2 did, however, begin in September, with decidedly mixed results, and I'm probably being a bit generous there. No matter what they tried, it seemed impossible to get the tank to move at more than 16 to 19 kilometers an hour, and it suffered countless engine failures. Testing was made even more complicated by the continuous attacks by Allied bombers. It's highly unlikely the Allies knew what was being built below, but in general, factories and manufacturing centers were attacked at a relentless pace. The number of impracticalities regarding the mouse was quickly stacking up. They found that if a mouse broke down, it was so heavy it would require 2 mouse to pull it. It was also horribly vulnerable to close-quarter attacks because of its hull openings and many grills that were needed in order to ventilate the giant beast. Lastly, the auxiliary fuel tank included at the rear would act as a bullseye for any would-be attacker, and a direct hit would lead to an almighty blaze. With Soviet forces closing in, the end for both the V-1 and V-2 came in April 1945. While there are fanciful stories of them being sent into combat as a defiant last stand, they are almost certainly inaccurate. The most likely scenario was that they were purposefully destroyed by the retreating Germans, probably with explosive charges. The thing is, they didn't even do a good job of that. While V-2 was badly damaged, V-1 managed to escape with only minor injuries and was discovered by Soviet forces in the Krupp factory in Essen. They also found the remnants of V-2 in Wunsdorf, which had been one of the Nazi headquarters. While the hull of the V-2 was destroyed, the turret had survived, and the decision was made to combine the hull of V-1 and the turret of V-2 before sending it back to the Soviet Union for careful analysis. It arrived in the USSR in 1946 and eventually found its way to the Kubinka Tank Museum, where it remains on show to this day. The question of how the Panzer VIII mouse would have fared on the battlefield has intrigued historians since its discovery. Would it have been enough to turn the tide of the war in Hitler's favor? Well, most agree no. Considering the catalogue of problems that came up during testing, it's difficult to imagine it would have been much help on the battlefield, and possibly it could have just been more of a hindrance. The mouse is remembered more like a vanity project than a viable piece of military hardware. But with its fearsome firepower and thick armor plating, had they managed to address its biggest issues, this could have been a hell of a tank. But quite astonishingly, amid the rubble that had become Germany, the Allies found plans for tanks that would have eclipsed even the mouse. Apparently, the Germans had been developing designs for a series of super heavy tanks. The blueprints for the Land Cruiser P-1000 Rat called for a tank weighing 1,000 tons and a crew of over 20. But we're not finished. The Land Cruiser P-1500 monster would have weighed at least 1,500 tons and had a crew of over 100. In all fairness, this would have been more of a mobile artillery gun than a conventional tank, and there is some doubt about how serious this proposal was, but still, well, thank God Hitler never got his hands on some of those. The Panzer VIII mouse is today remembered as a failure, too big, too heavy, and with complex engineering that needed years more work to perfect. It was a project that drained German designing, manufacturing, and testing at exactly the time it couldn't afford it. It was Hitler's monster that never quite was. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do smash that thumbs up button below. At the beginning of this video, I told you about keeps, which you should definitely check out if you'd like to keep your hair. Unlike me, there is a link below. Thank you for watching.